Hi everybody, this is Mrs. Kennedy and I'm coming to you with another Library Lady Read Aloud. I hope everyone enjoyed their spring break. I know that some people's plans got canceled and we weren't allowed to go do a lot of things, but I hope that you all took the time and spent it with your families as much as you could and had a wonderful, restful week. We are going to read from one of our favorite books, one of our favorite authors, Patricia Polacco. Thank you, Mr. Falker. I usually read this with my 3rd through 5th graders every year. It's just such a great book. And Patricia Polacco, I always get asked a few questions about her. Yes, she is still alive. Yes, she draws all of these pictures in her books. She actually has her own Facebook page where she's been reading several of her stories. So parents, if you want to go check that out to see if there's some other stories in there that your kids might like, that's a great place to go. And she's on there and they can actually see her and see her talk and read her own stories, which is kind of fun. Thank You, Mr. Falker is a wonderful story. It's very poignant. And so I'm going to jump right into it. It's a little longer than some of my read alouds have been lately, but it's worth it. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that the family could see, then dipped the ladle into it and drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. "Stand up, little one," he cooed. "I did this for your mother, and your uncles, your older brother, and now you." Then he handed the book to her. "Taste." She dipped her finger into the honey and put it to her mouth. "What is that taste?" the grandma asked. The little girl answered, "Sweet." Then all the family said in a single voice, "Yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made that sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of the book." The little girl knew that the promise to read was hers at last. Soon she was going to learn how to read. I love Patricia Polacco's illustrations. They're always so pretty. Tricia, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books home from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather and grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all, she hoped to read. Each day, she saw the kids in the 1st grade class across the hall reading. And before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. Not Tricia. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with crayons. "In 1st grade, you'll learn to read," her brother said. In 1st grade, Tricia sat in the circle with the other kids. They were holding Our Neighborhood, their first reader, sounding out letters and words. They'd say, "Bleh, bleh, oi, boy," and "look, look, look." And the teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got a word right. But when Tricia looked at the page, all she saw were wiggling shapes. And when she tried to sound the words out, the other kids laughed at her. "Tricia, what are you looking at in that book?" they'd say. "I'm reading," she'd say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up to the 2nd reader and the 3rd reader, she alone stayed in Our Neighborhood. Tricia began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. The harder the words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. Oh, how she loved to draw, or just sitting around and dreaming, or, when she could, going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandma were walking together in the small woods behind their farm. It was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Tricia said, "Grandma, do you think I'm different?" "Of course," her grandmother answered. To be different is a miracle in life. You see all of those fireflies? Every one of them is different. Do you think I'm smart? Trisha didn't feel smart. Her grandma hugged her. You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever. Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms, and reading didn't matter so much. Trisha's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky and they were the light of heaven coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side where the light comes from. One evening, they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass or you'll lift right off the ground and there you'll be. They both laughed and hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass because she went to where the lights were, on the other side, and not long after that, Trisha's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page, or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha watched the tops of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. And numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line up the numbers before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Trisha tried, the numbers looked like stacks of blocks, all wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew she was dumb. Then one day, her mother announced that she had gotten a job teaching in California, a long way away from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth, and it took 5 days. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she'd stumble over the words. The cat ran. She was reading like a baby in the 3rd grade, and when her teacher read along with them and called on Trisha for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. Hey, dummy, a boy called out to her on the playground. How come you're so dumb? Other kids stood near him and they laughed. Trisha could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Poor Trisha. That is definitely not kind. Trisha wanted to go to school less and less. I have a sore throat, she'd say to her mother, or I have a stomach ache. She dreamed more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school. And when Trisha started the 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teacher's pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe and Alice Marie, Davy and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Trisha whenever she was drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings. But they still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. Then one day she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Falker, in his plaid jacket and butterfly tie, said, "Stop! Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. He sat behind Trisha for 2 whole years, and he seemed to almost hate her. Trisha didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground, leaned into her face, and called her Toad. Trisha was afraid to turn any corner for fear Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who would tease her. I love this illustration because it shows all the words that Eric calls her and how they kind of swarm around her when he's being a bully. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Trisha, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and jump out and call her stupid or ugly. And Trisha began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the stairwell during free time, and she would not go outside at all. In that dark place, she felt completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he laughed, and he pulled her out into the hall and danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell." Trisha buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office, and when he came back, he found Trisha. "I don't think you'll have to worry about that boy again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Trisha shrugged. Trisha was sure Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence, then she'd say the same thing he did. "Good," he would say. Then one day, Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out little sandwiches as they worked and talked. All at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters, and you can write them on the board with a wet sponge as quickly as you can." "A," he shouted out, and she wiped a watery A. 8, he shouted out, and she made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q, he shouted out. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers. Then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Trisha knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down and tried to run. But Mr. Falker caught her arm and sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor baby," he said. "You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid." She sobbed. "But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through school all this time and fooled many, many good teachers," he smiled at her. "That took cunning and smartness and such bravery." Then he stood up and finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. They did lots of things she didn't even understand. At first, she'd make circles in sand, and then big sponge circles on the blackboard, going left to right, left to right. Another day, they flicked letters on a screen, and Trisha shouted them out loud. Still other days, she worked with wooden blocks and built words. Letters, letters, letters. Words, words, words. Always sounding them out. And that felt good. But though she read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence. And deep down, she still felt dumb. And then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4 months since they started, Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of a page and pointed at it. Almost as if it were magic, or as if a light poured into her brain, the words and sentences started to take shape on the page, as they never had before. "She marched them off to..." Slowly she read a sentence, then another, and another. And finally she had read a whole paragraph. and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. That night, Trisha ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open her front door, and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and grabbed a jar of honey. Then she went into the living room and found the book on a shelf. The very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey on the cover and tasted the sweetness and said to herself, "The honey is sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book." Then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears roll down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was happy. So very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know that because that little girl was me, Patricia Polacco. I saw Mr. Falker again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself. At first, he had difficulty placing me. Then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and asked what I did for a living. "Why, Mr. Falker," I answered, "I make books for children." "Thank you, Mr. Falker. Thank you." So we're always pleased to find out that not only was this a true story, that it was a story of the author, Patricia Polacco, who I already told you was a very prolific, which means that she wrote a lot, author, and she's still writing to this day. So that's wonderful. I love this book for so many reasons, and it's always hard for me to get through it without getting teary. I love this book because there's a lot of people who struggle to learn to read. And that's okay. That's something that happens. Sometimes people struggle with math. Sometimes people struggle with reading. Everybody has their strengths and their areas that they need to work on. Patricia really struggled with reading, and she actually, when she would look at the words, they would kind of move around, or the letters wouldn't look right, or they'd kind of mix themselves up. And that was why she was having such a hard time to read. There was an actual problem. My niece was in 3rd grade before they figured out that she was just really good at guessing and telling what was next to her in the picture. And once they figured out that she told them that when she looked at the letters, they bounced up and down. They switched lines. So sometimes the wiring in brains, they don't see what is on the page. And so once they figured out and could retrain her brain, and they used all these different strategies, because there's some marvelous reading teachers out there and special education teachers out there that's what they do. They figure out what the issue is and they can really help. She's now one of the biggest bookworms that I know. And what I like about this book is it shows that you have to speak up. Mr. Falker, if he hadn't found her being bullied and then started really watching her and then did that little game with the stuff on the board, he wouldn't have known. So if you're having a hard time reading, if the words jump up and down, or you're just struggling in any kind of way, make sure you tell your teacher, because we can't read your minds and we can't see what's inside your brains. But once she was able to work with her teacher and the reading specialist, she not only became a fabulous reader, she now writes children's books for a living. That's what she does. She gets to bless so many children with books to read. Books she wouldn't have been able to read until Mr. Falker stepped in and Miss Plessy stepped in. So I love that it's a true story. I love that it shows how we have to kind of speak up for ourselves when we're having a hard time understanding. And I love how it shows that sometimes one person can just really make a difference in somebody's life. We saw the hard part of that when Eric was bullying her and how he made her not want to come to school and really, really hate school. So that was the negative way that one person can really change somebody's perspective or life. And then the positive was Mr. Falker stepped in and he wouldn't let people make fun of her. And when he figured out that she had a problem seeing the words right, he got another teacher and they worked together. And just because he believed in her and told her that she was smart, she started to believe she was smart, and she ended up being able to read and become one of the best children's authors of our time. So I think that is awesome. And at the beginning of this book, I always like the dedication. It says, to George Felker, that's Felker. To George Felker, the real Mr. Falker, you will forever be my hero. So I hope you enjoyed this book. I know it's a little longer read aloud than we're used to, but it's definitely a book that when we read it together as a class, my kids love. So I'm very glad I got to share that with you guys today. Remember, speak up when you don't understand things, whether it's math or science or reading or social studies or anything. Speak up, let your teacher know so that they can help you, because we really do all want to be like Mr. Falker. We all want to be able to help. And we love you lots and we miss you lots. Have a wonderful night and always keep reading.